is a week 10 lecture notes, and I'm starting just kind of by jumping back a little bit to our discussion on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Transcendentalism, because I feel it's just really appropriate to review Transcendentalism when talking about Thoreau. So I'm just going to start just kind of jumping back to our lecture notes from week 6. And just to kind of recap what Transcendentalism is. So, you have that group, that younger generation of New Englanders in the 1830s who kind of got disenchanted with the Puritan religion. They felt that it had become kind of cold and impersonal. It lacked emotion, and that there was no sense of connectedness to God, which was something that they desperately sought. And so, to them, it seemed like the church had kind of moved its eyes away from heaven and had fixed them very much decidedly on the material world and getting and spending. So they began to embrace the idea that men and women didn't need the church to connect to God, and that nature was that medium with which they could find divine truths. And thought that, as a people, we could rise or transcend above the material world simply by accepting our own intuitions about God, nature, and experience. The idea was that we should rely on ourselves, thinking, trusting, and believing, and that we can find that in communing with nature, we can get in touch with that side of ourselves. So, taking a look, jumping forward to now to week 10, taking a look at Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is one of the most well-known, most famous American writers of all time. And for many different reasons. He was remembered, for his philosophical and natural writings, for his political writings about the government, civil disobedience, which were kind of revolutionary. It's kind of stated that he was one of the first anarchists of in America, and really, he was a dedicated abolitionist. He believed very strongly in the freedom for all men, and he wrote about that very frequently in his life. So let's take a look at his life just in brief really quick, and we'll talk about Walden before we kind of get into our text notes for the section that I had you read for Thoreau. So, born and raised in Concord, Massachusetts, went to Harvard College, which is now Harvard University. He studied Greek, Latin, and German. After graduation, he kind of had a little falling out. He didn't really know exactly what he wanted to do with his life. And so, men at the time period, educated men especially, they often went into the field of law, medicine, they joined the church, or became educators. And so he kind of briefly worked in that field. He set up a school with his brother John that lasted for a couple of years. But after John became sick, that venture kind of fell apart. And so he went to work. His father owned a pencil factory, and so he went to work for his father for a little bit. Now, so here he is, a college-educated man, a deep thinker. He's working in a pencil factory, and it's kind of not really lost, but just kind of trying to figure out who he was and where he wanted to be. And so he became friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom we talked about in week 6. And through him, he became immersed in that transcendentalism movement that Emerson was famous for, that we just kind of briefly touched on. So Emerson was older than Thoreau, but he became a mentor to him and supported him in many ways. Thoreau lived with Emerson as a caretaker for his home, and Emerson also used his influence to promote Thoreau's literary efforts, and some of his first works were actually published in the Dial, which was a Transcendentalist magazine. In the 1840s, Thoreau began earnestly writing nature poetry, but he kind of had become disenchanted with the rat race, I guess, as he called it, that surrounded him, and the fact that men seemed to be continually asleep in cogs in a wheel, only focused with getting and spending. So let's stop. getting and spending, and they were literally like men asleep that were working at a machine. And so he began seeking a simpler way of life. And so Emerson had some land that he owned in Massachusetts on Walden Pond. And so he said, you know what, take this land, go find yourself, live amongst in the woods. And so Thoreau did. He literally threw away, his possessions. He moved to Walden Pond. He built himself a small home, which I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in the screencast on Walden. And he lived there for about 2 years. And there he really devoted his time to his philosophical and literary pursuits and seeking a spiritual awakening and revolution for himself. He began writing. It was an experiment. It was a radical experiment. And people were interested in it. So he began writing about it in a collection of essays, which would go on to be published in a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods. Which was published in 1854, and it was a modest success at the time. It wasn't until much later that Walden became very successful. He had a run-in with the law during his time at Walden Pond. He refused to pay a poll tax, and they threw him in the chokey in jail. And that experience influenced one of his most famous essays, really, which was Civil Disobedience, which made a strong case for acting on one's individual conscience and not blindly following the laws and government policy. He said, the only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right. Very much that idea of, in that Transcendentalism belief of the self as the center. And so it became quite popular, very radical, published in 1849. It inspired many leaders of protest movements around the world because of its nonviolence approach. It was very attractive to American civil rights movement activist Martin Luther King Jr. And Gandhi, who helped India to win independence from Great Britain, among many others. After leaving Walden Pond, he continued to write about nature, wildlife, vegetation, plants, and that kind of thing. And he also remained a devoted abolitionist. In 1854, he wrote Slavery in Massachusetts. And then he also became enchanted with the story of Captain John Brown and the Harper Ferry raid. He was an abolitionist who led an uprising against slavery in Virginia. And so the story was in 1859 in October, they raided a federal arsenal to arm themselves, but their plan was thwarted, and Brown was captured and convicted of treason and put to death for his crime. And Thoreau wrote a very stirring speech, a plea for Captain John Brown, which is still very strong abolitionist piece of writing that came out of that time period. So he struggled with tuberculosis for decades. He actually had it in his early 20s, and it kind of stayed with him for his whole life, and he would have periods of wellness and periods of illness, and he succumbed to the disease in 1862. So Walden has gone on, and I'm really kind of focusing more on Walden because we focused on Walden in our readings this week. But it's gone on to inspire and inform the works of naturalists, environmentalists, and writers everywhere. And he's often called the father of environmentalism. And, his revolutionary views of government, civil disobedience, resistance to civil government, that was also that he was very popular for, and then those works of transcendentalism and being at one with yourself and pushing yourself to the center of your universe and making that very much your focus, trusting in yourself, believing in yourself. That is very much what Thoreau stood for.